Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Hey, Charlie.
How's everybody doing today?
Doing pretty well. How are you?
Good. Still working on my first cup of coffee, so.
Well, you seem pretty bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, so I'll take
thanks. Good.
that. Like I'm having a house party, all those doorbells ringing. I mean, it's 8:30 on a Wednesday, everybody. We just need to just kind of lighten up here.
Getting ready for trick or treat.
Scott, do you live somewhere where you're going to get trick-or-treaters?
I live somewhere where we get about 3 every year, so I don't think it's going to change
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was me last year. I bought a whole bunch of candy and nothing. I spent the whole year eating that candy.
And that's what I tell everybody, buy stuff you actually like yourself this year.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly.
Mr. Blair, I can tell by the cinder block wall you're actually at work today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Try to convince him to call in from home, but he doesn't do it. He prefers the cinder block.
It's a good look.
We can make him a faux cinder block and he could be wherever he wants.
Nice.
Sorry, I was having some connection issues. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Sir.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm like holed away in a corner in my house right now, so. All right, I will go ahead and call this meeting to order, the Retirement Commission. Looks like just about everyone is here, so we'll go ahead and get started. I think the first order of business, just real quickly, if we could have a motion to approve the minutes from September, unless anyone has any questions or corrections.
I move to approve the minutes as presented.
I'll second that.
I
All right.
missed him. I'll abstain.
All in favor?
Abstain as well.
All right, all in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Yes, aye.
All right, the next item and the main item for today is the presentation from Seichu. So thank you all for being here. I'll turn it over to Bill Dowd and you all can go ahead and get started.
Okay, Jason, I'm gonna try. I'll share my screen to show it. Hopefully that'll work for everybody.
Bill,
Yeah.
I have to say, I looked at what you sent really hard, and I had trouble figuring out what it actually was saying.
What do you mean?
Well, there were different ways of looking at things, and I just don't understand the terminology. You know, actual versus some other way of, I guess, actuarial versus actual. On some of the charts, there are different lines showing different things, and
Right.
I wasn't sure at the end what I was actually looking at and what it was actually saying.
Okay. That's not a good way to, but at least you said that up front so we can take more time going through. I think the problem is there's lots of different sets of rules, okay, about how we have to do calculations for different things. And for determining contribution rates, we do things one way. For determining the financial statement information, we do things a different way. And that's just because we have to. But it does make different answers, like things like assets, for example. We have two different numbers for assets, right? And you're like, well, wait a minute, we only have one pool of assets and it's worth this. Why we have two different answers? Well, we'll talk about that on the charts, but I'll try to make sure when we get to pages that we explain some of the terminology and try to clear that up.
That'd be great.
Okay, but I appreciate you saying that up front versus waiting until the end and we'll have to come back and start all over again. So thank you for doing that. And before I get started, I'm going to introduce, we've got myself on the call, Bill Reed's on the call, who you've met before in person, Dan Homan's on the call, who I think has been on calls before. He's in our Houston office. He handles the OPEB portion of the valuation. I don't know if he's ever presented to you before, but he's here on the call today. I don't know if Dimitri got or not. We have Dimitri Sherman in our Atlanta office, another actuary who does OPEB work, works with Dan. I sent him the link, but I didn't see him sign in. So, oh, there he is. Okay. Good morning, Dimitri.
Good morning.
All right. So I wanted to introduce him as well. So Bill and I will take the first half of this, or 2/3 of this, which is the pension information. And then I'll turn it over to Dan and Dimitri when we get to the post-retirement OPEB information. But again, thanks. Yeah, a lot of stuff we do is confusing, and we do it every day. And sometimes we need to step back and realize the rest of the world only sees this once a year. So try to make some sense out of it. Can you follow my slides? Okay.
So far?
All right, let's see. I'm trying to make them full page, but I'm not sure if that's working. Hold on just a second. There. All right, that should be better. So we'll talk about the retirement plan, and then we'll talk about the post-retirement benefits plan. On the retirement plan, we did the experience study last year where we had several meetings. We had an initial meeting where you approved most of the changes and assumptions that we recommended. Then we came back and you revisited a couple of things subsequent to that. You decided not to change the long-term rate of return assumption, which was really the last decision was made. So we're still using 7.5% for that. But you did adopt a lot of other assumption changes that we recommended as part of the experience study. And I think the results of the valuation are pretty consistent with what we expected them to be, other than the fact that we didn't have a great year for investments, right? And the experience study was done using last year's data. So the fact that the asset didn't perform the way we would hope them to perform was not something anybody took into account when we started doing that work. But anyway, barring that, everything else looks to be pretty consistent. You're amortizing the unfunded liability over the remaining 15-year period that you had to start with to determine contribution rates. And we'll show you the details of all that. There haven't been any changes in plan provisions. We're continuing to, all those increases in contributions from the employees that were phased in over a couple of years are still and will continue to be used to supplement the funding, not to reduce the employer contribution. So we've been doing that, and there was no COLA this year. Okay, even though we have an assumed COLA, the one was not granted. So that gave you a little bit of an actuarial gain because retirees didn't get a raise this year. Investment performance for the year, we assume 7.5%. Okay, so here's where we have two sets of confusing terminology, right?
First one.
First one. Okay. Fiduciary net position is the market value of assets, right? That's the value of the trust as of June 30. That's used for financial reporting by the city, for the balance sheet, for their CAFR, and to show the net pension liability. Okay. The return on the market value assets for the year was 3.08%, which actually, in our world of other plans, is not a bad year, right? A lot of plans were worse than that. Thank goodness we're not having this call in March. Of course, the answers would be a lot worse because you were probably negative at that point. But you came back the last quarter and had a return of 308, but that's short of 7.5. Okay, so you had a little bit of loss on the net pension liability, and you'll see that actually goes up because the investment return was not 7.5%. Now, we use a different value of assets to determine contribution rates, okay? To do contribution rates, what we do is we recognize differences in our expected rate of return of 7.5 and our actual rate of return this year, 308. If there's a difference between those two, we actually phase that and recognize it over a 4-year period, okay? And we do that to try to keep the assets a little bit more level for determining the contribution that the city has to make, because otherwise the budget would bounce around every year as the market value bounces around, okay? And all of our public sector plans use some sort of smoothing. It could be 3 years, could be 5 years. We don't like to use a period longer than 5 years, but that way we get a more level asset value to figure out how much the city has to contribute, okay? And those numbers are different. If the investment return is greater than assumed, that will lag because we'll recognize the good experience over a 4-year period. If it's worse, it'll exceed, and it should be a little bit more level line than market value. Okay, so that's the one confusing point. For GASB purposes, we calculate what's called the net pension liability, and there's also a net OPEB liability, which you'll see later. Same type of calculation. That's the difference between the liability for the benefits and that market value of assets, okay? And that increased from 84 million to 91.2 million, primarily because the assets only earned 3%, not 7.5%, okay? It was offset, it would have been worse, but the city put in an extra 1.8 million this year above and beyond the required contribution. So that helped a little bit, but it's still, still declined from the prior year. And the ratio then of funding went down from 58.3 to 56.8, which is about in line with what we're seeing for our other public plans on June 30. Okay, again, would have been a lot worse March 31, probably would have been 52% or something like that. So, it came back a little bit. I'm not sure where you are today since June 30. Market's been kind of up and down and flat and whatever. So, but at the end of the year, you lost 1.4% on your funded status, which, has to be expected when the return wasn't, wasn't 7.5%. The actuarial determined contribution, which is a rate that the city applies to payroll, to budget, across departments and everything else to make the contributions. It increased this year because of the funded position. It also increased because the payroll is a little bit lower. I think Sarah confirmed people left in the last, especially in the last quarter of the year, and they weren't replaced because the city had a hiring freeze. So when we did the evaluation, we actually had fewer active participants than we had a year ago. Now, some of them may have been filled since then, but we were down about 48 people from a prior year for this year's valuation because people left and weren't being replaced because of the COVID situation and everything else. So when we apply the dollar amount we calculate to the payroll, we get a higher rate, even though the dollars aren't really a whole lot different than they were last year. So from a budget dollar perspective, it doesn't come out that much different, but because the payroll was down a little bit, it gives a little bit higher percent. Okay, and I think we have a slide later that says in a city in like 6 of the last 7 years, you've actually contributed a little bit more than our calculation for whatever reason. Some years you had a little bit of a surplus, some years you wanted to fund a COLA, some years, you wanted to fund a pay raise, a lot of different reasons. But I mean, that's a good thing when you go report and you do a CAFR and you go to ratings agencies and everything else. It's like, the public plans out there that are in trouble are the ones that the actuary calculates an amount and then they short fund it, right? They fund 80% or 60%. You guys really almost in every 6 of the last 7 years have put in more than the required contribution, which is a good thing. And I think if you apply this payroll rate to the budget pay, you'll see that it's not going to be way out of line. It shouldn't be way out of line as far as the budget is concerned. It's very close to what we came up with during the experience study. So all in all, it was a pretty good year, all things considered. Everybody was scared to death, first quarter of 2020, when the market went way down and interest rates went way down, and we had no idea how things might rebound. Well, there was a pretty strong rebound, at least in the markets. Jim, we got a lot of other issues, obviously, we got to sort as a country and as a city, but at least from financial reporting on this plan, it wasn't nearly as bad as we might have expected.
Bill?
Yep.
I guess one question from a budgetary standpoint might be, if we're using this higher rate in the next fiscal year, but we do fill those positions between now and July, those dollar amounts would be higher, wouldn't they, if we're using that higher rate based on what we think payroll is now?
Yeah, they are. They will be. If I think our budget, our payroll was about 38 million projected, and if it ends up being 40 million, then you're right. It's going to be more budget dollars. But there are probably years in the past where it went the other way. All we can do is calculate a rate based on a snapshot of the census data. But an extra % or 2 on a $40 million payroll is $400,000, right? So, but yeah, to answer your question, you're right. If the payroll ends up being higher than we expect, then you're going to get more money into the system, and it's going to cost the city a little bit more money.
Yeah, Jason, that's going to happen because of the time lag between when we calculate the rate and when you actually collect it, and those are going to be pluses and minuses every single year, and hopefully they'll kind of even out. This year you had a lower payroll, which means this year, which was based on the rate we calculated 2 vows ago, was probably a little bit low. So then you pick that up, 2 years from now when you apply this rate, and it all kind of evens out. At least that's the theory.
Okay, with that. Okay, I'll turn it over to Bill, let him talk a little bit about the membership changes. We cut off a few years on these charts. Some of these charts, they're still a little bit hard to read, but we kind of like showing some history. So I think I chopped off 4 years at the beginning of this, so you can actually read it a little bit now. So
yeah, here's the membership. You can see after 2 kind of declining years after 2008, total membership has been going up every year. Bill did just mention on the pension plan itself, which you can see is split out by the different plan numbers, plan 1, 2, and 3, the first 3 rows there. If you add those up, the total pension plan went down this year. because you didn't hire any new people the last 3 months before the valuation date. But in total, when you also add the DC plan people, it actually goes up just a little bit from what's at 2122 to 2133. So 11 people higher in total. That's basically because of the DC plan. But if you look at the actives, plan 1 and plan 2 are prior year actives. So those go down every year because there's no new people getting into those 2 plans. And then of course the current plan is plan 3. That's the one that goes up every year. So you can see the numbers there. And the DC plan went up again as well.
What is the DC plan?
The defined contribution plan.
Okay.
I think people can choose whether they want the DB plan or the DC plan when they get hired. Typically, I think most people elect the DB plan, or more of them do, and the DB plan goes up every year. But this year, the DC plan, for whatever reason, went up and the DB plan went down. We don't value any liability for people in the DC plan, although I will note that 36 sort of rehires, if you will, that are currently in the DC plan actually have an old vested benefit in the DB plan. So obviously we calculate those prior benefits for those 36 people. But other than that, we're not including any additional liability for folks in the DC plan. And then, vested terms basically stayed the same this year. Those are people that were hired and have left, but haven't started retirement benefits yet. They'll be due a benefit in the future. And then of course the retirees keeps going up every single year. You can see that's sort of the green line there, sort of in the middle of the graph, and you can see it's been going up, fairly steadily every single year. And then on terms of the DB plan, again, plan 3 is the current plan, which started in 2017, going through 2020. It now includes 25% of the total participants, and that number will keep going up. There are still 25% in plan 2, and 50% of the actives are still in plan 1, which ended in 2012. And so those numbers will continue in that direction. Last thing I want to mention on this slide is that the number of retirees, like I said, does increase every single year. And now you basically have the same number of retirees in the DB plan that you have actives. I think the ratio there in the footnote there is 1.01. If you went back to 2008, you had 1 3/4 of retirees for each active. So that number is getting higher and higher, and you may possibly have more retirees than you have actives next year. Although if you're hiring actives again, that may not be the case, but we'll see.
Hey, Bill, quick question. On the folks in the DB plan, and when I look at plan 3, it's still on the rise, yet you said that the numbers were down. Does that mean that that's an aggregate of all 3 plans to get that downtrend?
No, it's really hard to see on this graph, but you have to add plan 1, plan 2, and plan 3 for each year to get the total number of actives. So plan 3 is always going to go up, more likely, because that's where all the new hires are going. And you did have some new hires this year because the payroll or the hiring freeze was only the last 3 months. So April through July of 2020. So you did have some new actives. So there are 178 new actives in plan 3 versus 158. But plans 1 and 2, they go down every year because people leave, they terminate, they retire. And then those people, if they get replaced, then go into plan 3. You have to add up the 3 numbers to get the total active count. And you'll see if you do that, that number did go down.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, actually, in 2020, it's 711 total. And in 2019, it was 759. So it's down 48 people.
Yeah. All right. Are there any other questions? We can move on to the next graph here. Net pension liability, which is for your financials and the CAFR. Total pension liability is also called the accrued liability that we calculate at 7.5%. That number went up from 201 to 211, mainly because of the changes in actuarial assumptions that we established due to the experience study. And then we compare that to the fiduciary net position, which is another word for market value of assets, which Bill talked about. And that number was 119,920 versus 117 a year ago. And we take the difference between those two numbers, and that's your net pension liability. Or another way to say it is your unfunded liability for the CAFR. And that amount increased from 83.9 to 91.1. Again, mainly because of investment performance on the fiduciary net position was only 3%, not 7.5% that we assume. And also because of the actuarial assumptions on the total pension liability. So pension liability goes up, assets go down, and net pension liability increases from the prior year. We do a impact if we were to change the interest rate plus or minus 1%, just to give you some sensitivity to that. And it roughly would change the NPL about $22 million if you change the interest rate. We don't calculate a different interest rate for your CAFR and for the net pension liability because you always make the actuarially determined contribution. And because you do that, we can use the expected rate of return, which is 7.5% for this calculation. So just as an aside, if you were ever to decide not to make the actuarially determined contribution, we would have to do a calculation and possibly come up with a lower interest rate, which would then raise the net pension liability even more. But we don't do that because you always make the ADC every year. Okay.
Questions?
So here's assets and liabilities. This is taking that same asset number we just looked at in total on the prior slide and carving it up between the different employee groups. So you've got the active liability there in the first row, term vest in the second, and retirees in the third. So you add those up, you get the total liability there, and then the same fiduciary net position that we just looked at. So we divide those each, and that comes up with your funded status, which again declined from 58.3 to 56.8, which is very close to what it was in 2018. So basically the same funded status that you had in 2018 is now for 2020. One thing is that, you can see the big red bar there keeps growing every year as the retirees increase, that liability increases. And actually retirees and terminated participants, which are your non-active employees. So these are employees that are no longer working for the city, now account for 68% of the total pension liability, right? That number was 64% last year. So the reason why that is important is that amount of your liability is basically fixed. I mean, those people have retired, they're receiving their benefits. Other than COLAs, which get granted most years, although not this year, those amounts are not going to change because they're receiving them. So that piece of liability is sort of fixed. So, if at any time you were to think about doing another plan study or whatever, which, you did in 2017, so I don't think you're thinking about that right now, but if you were, the amount of things that you could do to change the liability is smaller because the actives are only 32% of the total liability.
Yes, back in 2008, the retirees invested terms were about 55% of the total. So you can see how that's grown. And people are living longer, you get more of them, and they're living longer. So, that's a long obligation to pay.
Is that number pension liability retired? So the 135,496,000.
Yes.
Is that over a period of time?
Yes, it's the present value of their lifetime benefit, basically. Okay, so from whatever age they are today to when they die, and if they have a spouse's benefit, we have to factor that in as well. So it's paid, it's an annuity benefit. And it's just a discounted present value of that.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions on this one? Nope. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So here's the funded status for the last, 12 or 13 years. You can see it kind of bounces around. It did increase every year from 2016 to 2019 until this last year. And again, the reasons we've already mentioned several times is due to the lower asset performance and the fact that we increased the assumptions. So basically, we're about where we were again in 2018. You can see the footnote there. I'm not going to read them all about all the different kind of reasons why it was ups and downs in the future. If you have a question, go ahead and ask, but you can read the footnote later. I just again point out that we did go from 58.3 to 56.8, again, due to the investment performance and the change in actuarial assumptions.
I had a quick question here. If you don't have it now, it's fine, but could you get for us, could you project this out to when you think we might hit the 70% mark?
We do have that. We do have that in a later slide.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Of course, that assumes everything we've got in our assumptions happens.
Well, you're right. Yeah. There are a bunch of assumptions which we'll talk about, but we do have a slide that projects all these out into the future. Yes.
Yeah, I just asked because as part of the sustainability study, that was a benchmark we provided to employees. And so
Right.
we always like to talk about, how we're making that mark.
Okay. Yeah. We'll get to that. This slide here shows the rates of return. And David, getting back to your earlier question about actuarial versus market value, again, this is sort of where you see it a little bit. The green line here, which bounces all around up and down each year, is the actual market value return as reported by our investment advisor. So that's sort of, the actual number, if you will, the actual market value return. This year you got 3.08%, but that's the first year you did not exceed 7.5% until 2016, right? And because we're doing a 4-year average for your actuarial value, which is the blue line on this graph, and you can sort of see it's, it does go up and down with the market value, but not as much. You can see it sort of runs in the middle there of what the market value is, and that's by design, because that way your contribution rate doesn't go up and down as much each year based on the market value return. So what happens is this year we had a loss, right? You only got 3%, but we're only recognizing 1/4 of that loss in your actuarial value, plus 1/4 of the gain in 2019, plus 1/4 of the gain in 2018, and 1/4 of the gain in 2017. So as a result, your actuarial value actually exceeded the 7.5%. It was 8 something, okay? So even though you only got 3% on your market return, on your actuarial smooth value return, you got 8%. And that's again because of the smoothing that we're doing. And so the next year, regardless of what happens with the market, we'll only recognize 1/4 of that plus the prior 4 years. And so that's how we do the smoothing. So that helps keep your contribution rate from bouncing around as much. And then also you can see in the bottom footnote there, the 5-year average as of June 30, 2020 on market value was 6.76%. Actuarial value, because most of those were gains rather than losses, was a little bit higher at 7.22%. So you do have a little bit of a loss since we're assuming 7.5% on the 5 years, less on the actuarial value than you do on the market value.
I have a question.
Yes.
Based the 4-year smoothing, are there any guardrails that might make you take a look at that smoothing? I mean, obviously an outlier year, and just this morning everything's red, and you're reading things that, just like we saw in March, there could be a massive drop in equity values over the winter. Is there any siren where you say, man, this is way too big to smooth, and that?
No, the guardrail is actually in the calculation.
Okay.
We never use a value that's greater than 110% or less than 90% of the market value of assets.
Okay.
We always do the smoothing first. And typically in the last 5 years, you've always been within that 10%. So we haven't had to enact that. But there is the guardrail that if we were to get a number that was greater than 10% of the market value of assets in either direction, up or down, we would just use the 10% number, either 110% or 90%. So yes, there are guardrails that we can never be more than 10% of the market value.
And exactly, you know, John, if you look back to 09 on the chart, that's exactly what happened there. When 2008, when the market crashed, we had to go down to, we could do no more than 110% of market value. So we had a big drop in the actuarial value as well.
Yes.
Yeah, we like to smooth, we just can't be totally unrealistic, right? For a prolonged period of time, so.
Yeah, so yes, there are guardrails there. This slide shows the contributions, distributions, and investment earnings. Again, along with the the investment earnings, there's the red line there. So that's basically the same line that was on the prior page, rates of return, only this is in dollars instead of the other one. The employer contributions, there's the large blue line. That went up from 10.1 to 11.3, I think that says. And then the distributions is the big green line at the bottom. So you can see distributions continues to increase, every single year as retirees increase. And then the employee contributions is the purple line, which you can actually sort of see it now. Those sort of began back in 2015 or whatever, where you could actually see it. I will say that the employee contributions, I think, again, because we had less people this year than what we typically expected, and they may get back in the plan again next year. But the employee contributions has been increasing quite a bit until this last year. They basically stayed level because, again, you had the hiring freeze for 3 months. So employee contributions ended up staying level this year. And the employer contributions did go up because you were calculating a higher rate this year.
Yeah, if you look at net cash flow, I mean, you got 11.3 million in contributions. You got $1 million from the employees, so that's about 12.5 million, and you paid out 13.4 in benefits.
Yeah.
So part of what you're earning out of that 3% was used to pay benefits, right? And then the rest, which isn't much left to improve the funded ratio when you only earn 3%.
So I have a question, just to kind of circle back to this payroll number a little bit. So the payroll, the hiring freeze coincides nicely with the last quarter of the year, which is COVID, right? And so it's sort of somewhat, I mean, I don't know the actual numbers, so I'm, maybe I'm overreacting a little bit, but I guess my thought process here is that if you don't adjust, if we just take the numbers at face value, which is what we do every year, right? The payroll is the payroll, and that's the number, and you build in some assumption, that's fine. But in a year of COVID, I'm wondering, by not making some assumption, are we shooting ourselves in the foot by the time we get to the next year? So in other words, if we don't have, if we have a good investment return, then maybe you make that up and it's worth the gamble. But if we don't have a good investment return and you're assuming a lower payroll, that probably could have a potential to be higher. I'm just wondering if we're doubling down on a number that hurts us next year.
I mean, hurts us, how, in terms of your funded position, or?
Hurts us in that we are just building in a budget increase next year when we could have smoothed that out between this year and next year.
Yeah, I don't know. The problem, though, too, on the liability side is all those people that might have been hired the first week in July are not in the valuation either for their liabilities, right?
Right.
So if you don't contribute it on their behalf, then they're going to show up next year and the liability is going to go up more than you might have expected. So I don't know, it's kind of a double sword. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. If you had one of our other clients has a frozen group, okay, they don't let any new employees into the plan at all. So what we've talked to them about is us just calculating a contribution dollar amount, period, and saying, this is your budget number. We don't care how you apply it to payroll or people, just give the plan $12 million, okay? Because I can tell you the budget number, let's see, I'm not sure it's gonna happen if I get out of this. It's not, I thought I wrote it down, wait a minute, let me see. what the dollar amounts are. Yeah, it's like the 2022 budget number we came up with for cash was about $9.5 million. Okay, which really is about what you contributed last year, except for the extra 1.8 you put in.
Mm-hmm.
So that was our number. But you're right, if we apply that rate to a payroll that's now 10% higher, it's going to be a bigger answer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know how many of those positions you've actually filled and what's going to come back to bite you.
Yeah, and I don't have a sense of the real numbers either. It just, I guess thinking of all the conversations we've had that are financially based, there's always some allowance for COVID, right?
Right.
And it just seems like other than the, hey, your earnings were less, we haven't really made any allowances. And I don't know that we should. That's really my question.
Yeah, I think if you want to think about, if you do any kind of forecasting for FY22 payroll, and we can follow up and have a conversation about the dollar amount we think you need. And, if there's a real strong reason to calculate a different rate based on a better number for projected payroll, we could do that. But, all you're going to end up with is, potentially you might end up collecting the same dollars on a bigger payroll base, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing there's always going to be some tension between what's best for the budget and what's best for the fund. Like Bill was mentioning, in the last fiscal year, we were probably a little bit short because those positions weren't filled and we weren't making contributions. Now the rate's going to be higher because we think we're going to have fewer people. So from the fund's perspective, the worst case is we fill those positions and put a little more money into the fund. I understand from a budget perspective that, that budget number might end up being higher than it ought to be, but we didn't put in everything that in theory we should have this year, I guess would be the counter argument.
Well, and just to be clear, I'm not advocating to put in less. I'm wondering if we need to put in more. It's kind of where my line of questioning was going, simply because, our funded status did go down. We've committed, and Chris corrected me. I'm old and tired this morning. It is 80%, but not 70, as I said earlier, but we have commitments. And so, we do these things at year end to try to make up for these different assumptions or the things that we've changed. And we're probably not going to have that flexibility. And so, my thinking is, if the rate came in less, to me, it would be a no-brainer. Like, why would you reduce the rate for a plan that's 56% funded, right? But now that the rate is higher, I'm just wondering if it's high enough. Because what I don't want to happen is that we've gotten on a sustainability plan, and then we come in 3 or 4 years in a row, and our funded status keeps decreasing. That doesn't, that seems contrary to our goal.
I think you can always put in more money, and actually you have put in more money. I think something like 6 of the last 7 years than what the ADC rate is calculated to be. So you can always put in more money than what we calculate to help improve the fund status. And actually, Bill, you want to go ahead and go to the funded status slide?
The projection?
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say too is I think what you're saying, Chrissy, is that we come up with money almost every year, but it's always at the end of the year. Why not just build it into the budget up front so we don't have to worry about whether we might come up with it, especially in a year with COVID. If you look at our projections, assuming everything happens that we estimate, our funded ratio is going to go from 56% to, when did you say 70%? Okay, we're talking about 6 years, right?
80% in 2029.
Right. Yeah, and 70% there, and then 2029 to 80, and then 100% in 2033. Well, that's that's 13 years out. We know we're not going to earn 7.5% exactly every year, right? So this is going to go up and down. The question, I think, more begs the question, which I don't have in front of me, I could probably go back and get it and we can compare, is when we did the sustainability study, where had we hoped to be and where are we? And does that beg the question of, should we do additional funding?
I think if my info is right, I think we said in 10 years from, of course, I don't have the date.
It was probably 2017.
I think
It was 2016. So
I think it was a goal of 80% by 2028, because that's when I think it was 2018 is when we put in the, when everybody started contributing to the plan.
I think the question is, where are we versus that today?
Well, our projection says we're going to be at 79 by 2028. But in order to get there, you might be putting in more money than we had thought, right? Again, I have to go back and look at those projections, and maybe we should do that and follow up. But if Chris is right that the projecting back then was our goal is to get to 80% by 2028, even with a couple of years of not great investment performance, we still are performing to get pretty close to that 80%. Problem is, I think by now we were probably thinking we were going to be in the 60s and it was going to be a flatter line, right?
yeah, and Chris is right. I'm looking at the actual presentation. So we said that the changes were going to take effect in July 2017 and that we'd be at 80% in 10 years. So that would be the 2028. And so we really haven't moved the goal. I mean, we haven't moved that out. It looks like 1 year, right?
Right.
All things being equal. So I guess you could say we're on target, generally speaking.
We have to recognize the volatility that will come in the next 3 years. I mean, it could be really low in the short term, and then it might be really strong after that, but there's going to be a lot of volatility. And when we think about contributions that a city can make like we have been doing, I think we have to be realistic about how feasible that's going to be the next couple of years. Those lump sum contributions.
I agree. And I think we have to be realistic about what we can actually build in the budget too. But it would be nice to sort of, I don't know, think about that.
Can any of that COVID relief money be used in the pension fund? Or no?
My quick answer on that would probably be no, because it can't be used for revenue replacement. And so I think that, and I don't know of anybody who's actually used it for that purpose, explicit purpose. Maybe they can kind of move some use cases.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was
yeah, I don't. My hot take would be no.
Okay.
Yeah, we're actually in the midst of 6 days of continuing ed for actuaries, which you think this is bad, you should do that. But one of the sessions I was in yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about potential new, financial relief packages that are being bannered about. And one of the big issues holding up some of it, other than politics in general, is some of the states with woefully underfunded pension systems that have been woefully underfunded forever are trying to use this as a way to get money to shore those up, which has nothing to do with COVID, right? They've been shortchanging the funds forever, and now they're looking for a bailout under COVID relief. So I don't know if you can use it or not, but I think that's not in the spirit of the law.
But if the problem in the short term, looking backwards, is directly related to COVID, and you've got this money, you're not real, and you apply it, as I understand, and I may not understand it correctly, you have to use those funds for something that is COVID related. So would this not be COVID related, and could you not then use the funds for that purpose? It's not really revenue replacement. It's actually something that happened, and it was caused by that.
Well, we can debate whether it's revenue related or not, but the other reality is the city council has appropriated pretty much all of the CARES funds that we've received to date. So even if we could, those funds are pretty much spoken for at this point.
Okay.
Well, I would also offer too, and Jason can speak to this more specifically, but we're only looking at a snapshot in time, June 30, in terms of the investment. And so I'm not sure how much we've recuperated since then, but my sense is a fair amount. Or
Yeah, I mean, that's true. You know, throughout the fiscal year, it does bounce around a lot. I think our 9/30 number was up 5.5%. October's, been pretty atrocious. So it just depends when you take that snapshot for sure.
Okay, are any additional questions on this? If not, I'll turn it over to Dan, and well, I'll look at the contribution. Okay, I do want to show you the contribution rates, right? Because we're projecting now, if everything happens according to this plan, that the rate's going to go from 26% down to 21% over a period of what, 15 years, right? Remember, we're amortizing the unfunded liability over 15 years, right? So if everything plays out, by the time we get to that date, the mortgage is paid off, and now all we're paying for is benefits that are being earned, right? Well, a whole lot can happen, but this is the 15-year amortization plan for the unfunded liability. And here's where, if you're on council or a city manager, at that point, you got wonderful budget relief. Of course, we know, it's going to be a somewhat different ride. Okay. Post-retirement benefits plan. I'll turn it over to Dan. I think the story here is, the good story about this is that you're actually funding it and doing a good job of that, which a lot of localities ignore the fact that they have this liability other than to put it on their balance sheet, and they don't accumulate any assets. So you could have done a good job at that. So I'll turn it over to Dan and Dimitri and let them walk you through some similar information.
Well, good morning from Houston, Texas. Appreciate the time. The good news on the OPEB side, we only have one value of assets. We use market value for everything. So we don't get involved in all this actuarial value. So everything you see on the OPEB stuff is strictly market value. We don't do any smoothing. We just use the values as is on the dates. So just a couple of quick comments on the good side here. If you recall, we did an experience study last year. And because of the changes in that experience study, that resulted in about a $2.2 million gain on the OPEB side. So in other words, changing those assumptions, we probably had more turnover, so we're kicking more people out. So we actually have a reduction of $2.2 million. The other good news is your claims experience for your active retirees was very good in 2019-20. And because of that, you're actually charging the same premiums, which means your costs didn't see the anticipated inflation that we have of 7.5% in the 1 year. So because of that good experience, that resulted in a $4.3 million gain. So you can see on the good side, we have a $6.5 million reduction in liabilities due to the newest assumptions and the actual experience. If you go to the next page, Bill, then we have the bad news. And as you saw in the pension, this is not surprising. Our return on assets, market value, now on the pension was 3.08, on the OPEB was 3.13. It's just the way things work out. But because of that return being less than the 7.5%, we had a $2 million loss. So if you take a $6.5 million gain from the previous page and take off that $2 million, we're at $4.5 million reduction in liability from the prior year. So because of that, you can see there in the middle, the funded status went from 56.5 to 62.8% on the OPEB plan. And because of that higher funding, you can see the annual required contribution has been decreasing. It was 12.1 for fiscal 2020, down to 9.4 based on last year's valuation. For fiscal 2021, down to 7.68 based on this most recent valuation, which we use for the fiscal 2022 contribution. The other unfortunate news is, you know, on the pension side, they say that you guys put in the extra $1.6 million on the pension side over and above the annual required. In the past, the OPEB plan received some extra funds, and this year we didn't receive any extra funds for the OPEB plan. So next slide, please. Let's get into head counts. So you can see the overall population is about the same. That's probably reflecting of the hiring freeze. So nothing strange going on here. You can see the totals were 1596 versus 1579 last year, 1551. So it's a relatively stable population over the last 3 years. Next slide. All right, now once again, this nomenclature. Fiduciary net position is just another term for assets. So you can see the green bar is the total value of assets that we have, and then the component parts of the ins and outs are the little bars on the graph. So if you look at 2020, you start the left-hand side, you'll see a darker blue. That's employer contributions. And you can see over the last several years, it's been relatively the same. You'll notice the employee contributions, the orange line, has been increasing. You can see back in 2015, we were just at 926,000, and in 2020, we're $1.3 million. And the difference is, just a quick overview, you know, we have grandfather retirees in the OPEB plan, we have Plan 1 retirees, and we now have some Plan 2 retirees. And the difference is the grandfather retirees don't really pay much for the coverage. Plan 1 pay a little more if they have less than 25 years, and they pay more for the post-65 coverage. And then for the Plan 2 folks, they pay the same pre-65 as the Plan 1, but they do not have post-65 coverage. So as we go out, we're having more Plan 1 retirees making contributions, and that's why the employee contributions are ratcheting up, because we have more Plan 1 retirees retiring, paying a higher contribution rate for coverage. You can see the maroon line is our premium payments. As I said, you know, last year we had $5.9 million. This year we only had 5.4. So you can see that's the result of the good experience for the claims, especially for retirees. You can see the expenses. It's pretty much, you know, been level. So the net investment income, you can see obviously the drop. As we said earlier in that last slide, we lost $2.2 million. We can see right there it is, from 3.3 to $1.4 million. So our overall net asset value is 46.8, and last year was 44.9. Next slide, please. Now we get into the liabilities and the funded percentage. So first of all, the blue bars are the liability. The maroon bars are the assets. And the green bar is the unfunded liability. And then the the purple line is the funded status. So the way you read this is all the dollar signs are on the left for the blue, the maroon, and the green bars. And then the funded percentage for the purple line is on the left-hand side or right-hand side of the chart. So you can see we had the big jump from 56. Actually, if you go back in 2018, we were at 47.4. Last year, we're at 56.5. And this year, we're at 62.8. Any questions on those results? If not, next slide, please. All right, there's a lot going on here. This is just the cash flows, the ins and outs for the plan, and you know, seeing graphically, we've already talked about most of this stuff, but you know, that's what's going on. And you can see, you know, the blue line, once again, that's the net cash flow. So you can see it's been positive going back to 2011. So in other words, we're bringing more than we're paying out every year, which is allowing us to grow the asset value and grow the funded status. Next slide. This is just the historical contribution rates for the OPEB side. And you can see once we talked before, back in 2018, we're at 12.1. Last year we're at 9.4. This year we're at 7.68. Next slide. All right, now we're getting into these projections. And all we do is we just, assume that, just like the pension side, the population remains the same. But however, you got to remember, when we have a person retire, it's probably either a grandfather retiree or a Plan 1 person. But the new person we're bringing in is a Plan 2 participant, which means they don't get post-65 coverage. So the cost for a replacement person in this 10-year projection is a lot less than the retiree we're kicking out because of the coverage they have. But that's how we're doing it. And you can see how what we're assuming for our assets. We're assuming 7.5% is going to be earned every year in the future. We have our medical trend, we have our dental trend, and we assume the covered payroll is going to increase at 3%, just like the pension. And based on that, let's go to the next slide. You can see the liabilities that we expect. So we're right now at $74 million at 2020. And at the 2029, we're just at $90 million. This is just liabilities. We will marry, the assets here in a second, but that's what we're looking at in terms of liabilities. And you will see, obviously, the retirees are becoming a bigger and bigger portion of the liability. Okay, next slide, please. So here are the liabilities in the blue, and the maroon line is the market value of assets. So we're projecting, as you can see, it's increasing in terms of funded percentage a little bit over the next 10 years. So in other words, the assets are growing a little bit faster than the liabilities are. And on this graph here, it shows you the OPEB projection. So I'm not sure if you have any type of anticipation for the OPEB plan for funded levels, because the OPEB plan is about a third in liabilities of what the pension plan is. So you can see going at 10 years, we're just over 70% funded on the OPEB side of the plan. And this is assuming, once again, we are just going to get the actual determined contributions and nothing above that.
And I was just going to comment that one of the reasons this is I think on the pension, we showed us going from 56 to over 90% or 80%, 80% by 2029. The amortization on the pension is a shorter amortization for the unfunded liability, which is why we're projecting a faster improvement. Here we're using 20 years. On the pension, we're using 15. So it's a shorter mortgage on the pension.
Right, and that's been declining. We were, it started at 30, we're down to 20 years. We reset at 25. So next slide just shows you the anticipated employer contribution rate based on the actual determined contribution. And assuming everything goes as planned with no additional monies being allocated to the OPEB plan above the required, you can see your anticipated contribution rate is very level for the next 10 years. Assuming that everything happens as we expect, which we know will not happen. That's not reality. So if we go to the next slide, in the OPEB plan, we have retiree contributions because they pay a certain portion of the cost. So you can see here, the maroon line is what the employees pay for the coverage, and the blue line is what the employers paid. And you will see it has actually started to converge because, once again, we'll be losing the grandfather retirees who are paying less for coverage, and we'll get more Plan 1 and Plan 2 retirees, and they're paying more for coverage. So the actual anticipated increase in the employee portion is growing quicker than the employer portion.
Yeah, right now the employees are paying maybe a third of the cost, and here they're going to be paying more than half the cost, or the retirees rather.
Right. And I think that's all for the OPEB side. I hope that was not too terrible of a treatment. Any questions?
It's a good story on OPEB. Obviously, I don't have another client that has a better funded OPEB plan than the pension plan. Okay, you wish your pension was better funded. Everybody does, but I mean, as far as the story to tell about how you're managing these benefit plans, I mean, this is a great story on the OPEB side, and And the other thing I'll mention is when it comes to these contribution rates, we actually break the rates down for the budget folks between, I mean, these are all blended rates across the entire payroll base, but we actually have different rates for general employees, public safety employees, and even on the pension side, the library has some participants and they have a different rate. But these are all aggregate. And the library is a very small piece of the funding of this, but it is a piece on the pension.
So Dan,
Yes,
I have one kind of off-topic question for you, and it's a
Yes.
curiosity thing. You're in Houston, right?
yes, sir.
Do you know where your one drop box for voting is?
Yes, I do.
Amazing.
I already early voted, so I'm done.
Okay, good for you.
Any other questions?
No, that generally looks pretty good. Thanks, Dan. Good presentation.
Welcome.
I guess my only question is like, should we be waiting another year before we kind of check in on these things, or should we have a midpoint check-in? I just don't know, I just feel like there's so much uncertainty in the next year, especially as we're building the next budget. I'm just trying to figure out how I might need to consider things differently.
Heather, that might be a good idea. I'd say maybe we watch the market and see how it reacts to everything that's still yet to unfold, and maybe around mid-year, take a look at that question again. Not mid-year, mid-fiscal year, January 1st.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you probably get quarterly reports on the funding, the market value assets on the plans, right, from your investment advisor. But if you wanted us to update liabilities, like at 12/31, especially if you've gone through a hiring, process, I mean, we could certainly do that to give you some idea where things stand. It's probably going to be more related to the asset performance than the liability changes, but
even if it's just internal on our end, just to kind of take a moment halfway through the fiscal year as we're just getting ready to hammer out the next budget, and
Right.
know what our year end for this last fiscal year, that we'll know that by December. And I just feel like it's worth even just taking a pause and just kind of reflecting on where we are and what options we have for strengthening it. So.
And I will say on the health side, we have noticed a lot of our clients, yes, there was an impact on the claims due to COVID in March and April, but things have started to pick up again in May and June. So they're back to almost normal for most of our clients. So yes, part of your gain on the OPEB side was probably from the impact of COVID in terms of the claims. But for the most part, most clients have picked back up by June 30th in terms of what was not happening in March and April.
when do you set your, Sarah, I don't know if when do you set your actual medical rates and things? Do you use the fiscal year or do you use January?
We use the fiscal year.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm going to say for people with January 1 renewals on healthcare side, they're seeing really good experience because so many people didn't do things in the first quarter of the year, especially, it's procedures. But there's a pent up demand that's coming back now. And so by the time you get around to June 30, you're probably going to have a fairly normal year of experience, whereas this last year was, the experience was good.
Yeah.
All right, well, it sounds like that might be it.
Well, thank you, everybody. We appreciate your time listening to us this morning.
Thank you.
Hopefully next year or the next time you need us, we can actually come in person. Would be nice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good seeing you guys, though. Thank you, Seiju.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Nice seeing you.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, so hopefully everyone on the commission is staying. We have a couple more items. I wanted to give a quick update on where we were on the ESG sustainable investing. And then I think Lisa had a couple, maybe just one items to discuss as well. Lisa, do you want to do yours first? We can go ahead and get those out of the way.
Absolutely. Can you guys hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, so I'm just gonna give an update on, we had a vacancy when Mr. Swanson resigned from the commission. So I wanted to let you all know the status of that and how he's gonna be replaced. So I talked to Max Robinson about it, and she let me know that the council makes board appointments on a quarterly basis. So the next time they're gonna make appointments is in December. She has posted the vacancy. She did it a couple weeks ago, and she's going to be receiving applications through early December. And then the council will make an appointment at the December 21st council meeting if there's a suitable applicant. So what I mean by that is you should keep in mind that according to the city code, one of the community members appointed needs to have a financial background. So they're looking for someone who has a little bit of either investment or banking or retirement plan administration background. And it's possible that there won't be any applicants, so then she'd repost it in January.
All right, I'm gonna go actively try to find some people.
Okay.
And then I think we were trying to reschedule the November meeting so we could still meet.
Yeah, so every single person, I reached out to everybody and everyone agreed that we can meet 1 week earlier for November. So I think it's November 18th is the new date.
And that'll cover November, December. Did we decide to collapse them? I can't remember.
You
No?
guys gotta decide on that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's certainly an option. We usually do.
We collapse them
Have a
usually?
month off somewhere in there. So maybe we could decide that at the November meeting.
Yeah. But we don't feel like we have to meet.
Well,
And
you know, I
certainly
think
we'd
last
love to
year, I don't
give,
think we met either.
sorry, I was just gonna say, if we find that in November, we don't have to meet in December, that's certainly the preference to not be taking up staff's time with those meetings in December, especially with the holidays. But if we need to meet, we need to meet, but
All right. Well, that sounds good. There were quite a few other attachments that I sent out. I don't expect that we will get through all of them today. One of them was a follow-up from DAHAB. There were some questions around what our alternative investment managers are doing in regards to ESG and sustainable investing. And so Greg from DAHAB talked to Prudential, which manages the 2 real estate portfolios, and he talked to Ceres and UBS, who manage the 2 agriculture portfolios. And I sent along just a short PowerPoint from DAHAB that kind of talked through how they approach ESG and those things that are already sort of involved in the portfolio. So I'm not going to go through that. You all can look at that. And I'll actually send out, there's even more information. Prudential just put out an annual ESG report that's like 60 pages. So if you really want to see what they're doing, I'll forward that along. It's actually pretty interesting. So that's quite long, but I'll send that in case you really want to look into what they're doing in the portfolio in regards to real estate. And also we got a quarterly report from Ceres, and one of the highlights that they talked about this quarter was specifically about their solar and wind installments that they have on some of their farms. And so I'll send that along as well. And that's just, I mean, it's a great thing that they're doing, but it's just value add to the portfolio. If they have a small strip of land that's not farmable, they will lease it out and put solar panels on it. And so they're making lease payments, lease income from doing that. And so just wanted to share that. I'll send that out as well, just so you can see, just with the idea of that we are tracking these things. We are sort of keeping a record of what our managers are doing. We're letting them know that it's something that's important to us. And more we're seeing that show up in their quarterly reports. So that's about all I have for the alternatives. Did anyone have any questions or want more information when it comes to alternatives?
Jason, if I send you an article, could you send it out to the commission and there was just a really good piece I read over the weekend. And it's strange how quickly things are evolving in the market, but it was very much that the traditional oil and gas sector is now down to 1.91% of the S&P 500, and it's just rapidly declined in the last 5 years. I thought it might be of interest.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen quickly here. Oops. All right, can everyone see that? Yes, okay. So this was one of the attachments that went out as well. I was trying to sort of summarize where we are in all of these things. This first section we'll get to here in a second. But we have a document that's an investment policy statement. It's about 7 pages. It details our asset allocation. It details sort of who does what and what the parameters are for our investments. I think, if we are going to continue down this road, we ought to add some language to the investment policy statement, just sort of stating that, sustainability is something that's important to the fund. This is why we believe it's important, and this is how we're going to monitor and track it, and how we're going to ask our managers to implement those factors into our portfolio. And so this is sort of one approach that we might be able to take for doing this. And I don't know that we necessarily have to, try to vote on this today. We certainly could, depending on the temperature of where everyone is feeling on this. But I'm trying to make this a little bigger. So I was thinking that one thing that we might want to consider is adding a section to the investment policy statement that just sort of, goes through what our beliefs are, how we might want to incorporate this, and then specifically what those beliefs are. Because one of the things that we talked about was building a framework and then using that framework to identify certain areas that we think are important. So a year from now, if something else comes up, we would be able to add that without having to redo this whole framework. This would be the framework that we would use to sort of evaluate, if something else comes up that we think poses a risk to the portfolio, whether it's, privacy concerns and technology or something else, we would be able to sort of filter it through these ideas and decide whether we wanted to add that to our sustainability beliefs. So that is one thing that I wanted to share. We can certainly continue to work on that if we like. It's a little difficult to find the time to do it. It might be something that we could try to focus on in the November meeting. I don't think there's anything else on the agenda for that meeting, but we could certainly work on this between now and then as well.
So Jason?
Yeah.
Within the context of that right there, what encompasses sustainability?
Well, I think what we're trying to identify, over the last year or so that we've been working on this, it seemed like the main sustainability initiative that the commission wanted to focus on was around fossil fuels and climate change. We did talk about a few other ideas. My sense was that the commission didn't feel strongly about incorporating other sustainability beliefs. But I think that, it sounds like at least some people on the commission think that climate change and fossil fuels pose a risk to the portfolio, and we ought to actively take steps to address that risk in the portfolio. So I don't know.
But what you said just a moment ago, I thought was good in that sustainability is not just this. It's a framework that allows for other ideas to fit within that framework, which I think is important.
And I think Scott here, that maybe a definition in whatever we provide of sustainability might be warranted.
Okay. Okay, so looking at adding a sort of a definition for sustainability.
Yeah.
Sustainability is in our context as its use.
Right. So that
Okay,
it becomes flexible. It becomes more flexible to deal with things that are beyond climate change and fossil fuel.
Sure. Okay, yeah, we can work on that. That's good feedback.
Can we take a look at your sample motion?
Sure. So these are just sort of the areas that we had talked about. You know, we spent a lot of time talking about Cornerstone, just due to the fact that it was sort of an easy target in the sense that there were only 30 names in the portfolio. One of them was related to fossil fuels. It would be very easy to swap that one name out to get out of that position and just replace it with another one. If you remember, that was the historical performance that we looked at, where they had similar position portfolios and they were able to provide a comparison over the last 10 years for what the performance had been in sort of an alternative portfolio. Granted, it was a very favorable 10 years to not be in fossil fuels, but you know, sort of the first suggestion would be, let's go ahead and take that step related to Cornerstone and just make that portfolio fossil fuel free. Again, it's one name. They said they can do it. It really will not have a significant impact on the performance. So that's large cap value. Our large cap growth manager is Wells Capital, and that's also a separately managed portfolio, and we could ask them to do a similar thing. Because of the nature of that investment, being a large cap growth, they don't have any fossil fuel names in their portfolio. They tend to be slower growing companies. They're not going to be in that portfolio. However, they do have sort of related industry names. So there might be a drill maker, and they might make drills for, you know, fossil fuel exploration, but they might make drills for other things. But they are, you know, related industry. And so that might be a discussion that we want to have with them, that, you know, we can go ahead and exclude those fossil fuel names. It probably would not have a big impact, but then continue that discussion with them on sort of those ancillary services related to the development and exploration of fossil fuels. And I think we would need, you know, sort of a deeper dive there to take the next step if we wanted to, because it would be a larger percentage of the portfolio if we sort of took that second step there.
What's the size of the portfolio?
Yeah, I've got that right here.
And while you're looking at, I think it brings up another interesting thing that may require definition, and that's around fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, if we were to eliminate fossil fuels from everything that we invest in, which would include perhaps the injection molded plastic pieces and surgical instruments, I mean, do we really want to go there? I think clarifying where our limits and where we draw the line for fossil fuels definitely needs to be defined.
Yeah, that's true. So Cornerstone is about 13 million, and Wells Capital is about $21 million.
Oh, I meant numbers of holdings. Cornerstone's pretty focused.
I'd have to look. I think it's about 70, but I can get the exact holding list for you. Yeah, they do hold a larger portion of the market, so. So yeah, Scott, that's a good point. I think, you know, this sort of proposal was worked up using sort of the narrowest definition of fossil fuels. It's about 15 names. And if you look down here, that list there are about 15 names, and they're the ones that have what they call proven and probable reserves. So these are the companies actually holding the fossil fuel reserves. These sort of products that come out of that may or may not be included depending on who is producing them. But yeah, that's a good point.
Scott, could you say what you said again?
I was just saying that we might need to also define what fossil fuels are for our purposes of this document. Fossil fuel extraction, production, manufacturing, processing is one thing. But to get into just the broad use of the term fossil fuels, does that mean that you're also not going to invest in a company that injection molds a plastic part that goes into a surgical instrument because it's made of fossil fuels? The plastic part is, I mean, broadly interpreted, you could say you shouldn't invest in any company that manufactures plastic. I think we need to be careful about that. Did that make sense?
Yes.
The sort of the third area that one of the other requests that came out of our last meeting was to look at SSGA, which is our index provider. We have several different investments with SSGA across different asset classes. And the commission had asked for a proposal on an alternative to the large cap enhanced index, which sort of mirrors the S&P 500. And so that was included in what went out. Basically, they have this S&P 500 fossil fuel free index, which essentially eliminates 15 to 17 names of sort of those largest fossil fuel producers from the portfolio. So it reduces the overall index by that number, by about 15 names. So that's sort of like just the very most specific approach that we can take to say, well, we would swap out this index and we would put in this other index, and we're going to cut out these 15 names that have proven and probable fuel reserves. It doesn't cost anymore. Actually, I think the index costs less than our current investment because what we're doing now is sort of this enhanced approach that they're doing. It is slightly active. So we'd be going purely to a passive approach, and actually would cost a little bit less than what we're doing right now. So I did send along somewhere the comparable performance for that enhanced index over the last 10 years compared to what we have now, and also compared to the S&P 500 index, just for you to look at.
So were you aware of, enhanced to me sounds like it should be better. And clearly it's the worst. So this seems to be a no-brainer. Forget sustainability. Did you know about this?
Yeah, there have been times. Basically, the approach that they take is they take the 500 or so names in the S&P 500, and they use a quantitative analysis to chop off about 200 of them, and they end up with a portfolio of about 300 names that they think are going to outperform. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. When it does work, we actually have to pay them a performance fee, which we have paid, but yes, it's been several years since we had to pay them a performance fee because, as you can see, they've underperformed the index.
Always. 10 years, all
I
right.
don't disagree, yeah.
By well, the comparison is compelling, and we ought to make this change.
Yeah, so there's that. And then I guess I would propose that we would continue to work through each other investment on a case-by-case basis to determine, which ones are easiest to do over time, and we would just, keep coming back to the commission as we found ways to implement the strategy. The three changes in the large cap area represent about 30% of the portfolio. So we would be moving about a third of our assets into some sort of fossil fuel-free investment. It's almost half of the equity portfolio that we would be making this change to.
How much do you think, Jason, of the mid cap and small cap positions actually would fit into companies that deal with fossil fuels? I would think not many at all.
Yeah, I think when we looked at it last year, there were not many, but there certainly were a few, and we could talk to, those managers to see what they thought about making a similar change. I do know we took a look at SSGA, which also manages the emerging markets portfolio in an index. They are currently standing up a fossil fuel-free index similar to this one, but it's not quite ready yet. There were quite a few number of names in the emerging markets area. The list was much longer than this large cap list. So there's considerable exposure depending on what asset class you're in and whether you're domestic or international. So that would be a more significant change that I would want the commission to look at in more detail to understand what the implications might be, since fossil fuels play a larger percentage when it comes to emerging markets than they do in the S&P 500, for example. And then here's just the list of names that initially showed up in that screen. So probably heard of a lot of these, and these are the ones that would typically come to mind when you think of those companies in this area.
Is our international,
any other questions or thoughts?
Is our international stuff primarily indexed?
It is a mixture. So we have an international index and an emerging markets index, but we also have active managers in both of those areas as well. So it gets more complicated as you start moving on to the other asset classes.
Mm-hmm.
So given like we're at 10 o'clock right now, do we want to just have this be like our first agenda item next? And then I guess it's only a couple weeks from now, where we just kind of assess like what actions, formal actions we want to take here now everyone's kind of had a chance to step through.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
I appreciate the summary.
Okay, well, if you have any thoughts between now and then, yeah. And we'll tee up something similar to this for November then.
Jason, at our last discussion, there was a great one-page sheet that had every one of our asset pieces of the portfolio and in a matrix, which could that be part of the discussion at the next meeting too? I
Sure.
think it sheds light. Yeah, that was great information, Jason.
Thank you, everybody.
Are we
Anything else?
adjourned?
Is that it?
Move to adjourn. Yeah, I'm with you, Scott.
So moved.
Okay. All in favor?
Thanks.
Aye.
All right. Bye.
All right.
Have a
Goodbye.
great day, everybody.
Bye, you too.